17 years old, Billboard #1, the most famous band on earth, dethroned by a teenager from a nowhere town. But that was just the opening act. He became the secret weapon behind blues rock royalty. He performed surgery on recording tape, cutting, stitching, Frankensteining together the instrumental that would dominate a decade. He composed the war cry that transformed a blonde wrestler into an American god and gave politicians their victory soundtrack. And yet, ask any music fan to name him, and you'll hear silence. No heroin needles, no hotel balconies, no flaming car wrecks. Just a man whose brilliance became his invisibility, so masterful at every role that the world never knew which spotlight to shine on him. This is what happens when you're too dangerous to be famous. This is the untold saga of Rick Derringer, pronounced Derringer, the architect the industry forgot. But to understand how a legend becomes a ghost, you need to go back to the place where precision wasn't optional, where one loose bolt meant disaster. Fort Recovery, Ohio, mid-1950s. If you blinked driving through, you'd miss it. A railroad junction town where steam whistles marked the hours and fathers came home smelling of grease and steel. Rick Derringer's old man worked the Nickel Plate Railroad, not as a dreamer, but as a section foreman. The guy who made sure every coupling locked, every signal worked, every rail aligned down to the millimeter. One miscalculation and tons of metal went sideways at 60 miles an hour. Young Rick absorbed that worldview without even knowing it. Systems, precision, consequences. But music, that wasn't on the blueprint yet. Then one afternoon, everything changed. His Uncle Jim arrived at the house with a guitar slung over his shoulder. No fanfare, just family. But when Jim's fingers touched those strings in the small, warm kitchen, something detonated inside 8-year-old Rick's chest. It wasn't just sound, it was architecture. Notes stacking into structures, tension releasing into resolution. His uncle didn't play simple campfire strums. He wove jazz progressions, complex harmonies that shouldn't have made sense but somehow did. Rick stood frozen, watching, absorbing, calculating. A year later, his parents made a gamble. They bought him an electric guitar for his 9th birthday. Most kids treat gifts like toys. Play hard for a weekend, then forget. Rick Derringer treated it like a laboratory. Of his first instructor, no music conservatory professor, a guy named Gene Feely, pronounced Feely, who fixed Fords for a living at the town garage. Feely smelled like motor oil, not cologne. He showed Rick 2 foundational chords, G and D, figuring that'd keep the kid busy for a while. Rick went home that night and played those 2 chords until his fingertips bled. Not hundreds of times, thousands. Over and over until the motion wasn't a thought anymore. It was reflex, burned into muscle and nerve. This wasn't talent. This was obsession wearing the mask of discipline. By 15, Rick and his younger brother Randy, a natural drummer, had assembled a band they called the McCoys, pronounced McCoys, inspired by an instrumental track they worshipped. But don't picture fumbling garage kids butchering Louie Louie. Picture a military operation disguised as a rock band. They rehearsed like shift workers clocking in, on time, locked in, relentless. They cycled through names, Rick and the Raiders, Rick Z Combo, building a reputation across Midwest dive bars and VFW halls as the tightest young act anyone had seen. Uncle Jim hadn't just taught Rick chords. He'd exposed him to jazz standards, strange time signatures, melodic complexity light years beyond what most teen guitarists could even hear, let alone play. This made Rick dangerously versatile, a gift that would open every door in the industry and later close the most important one. But in 1965, none of that mattered yet, because the McCoys were about to get the call that would rewrite their entire trajectory. The only question was, would they recognize the trap hidden inside the opportunity? Summer 1965, Dayton, Ohio. Imagine you're 17, playing clubs for gas money, when 3 slick New York producers show up and offer you a ticket to the big leagues. That's what happened. The McCoys were hired as backing musicians for a group called the Strangeloves, except there was no group. Just 3 songwriters and producers in disguise. Feldman, Gotterer, pronounced Gott-er-er, and Goldstein. They needed young faces to sell a song they were convinced could explode. The song, My Girl Sloopy. It had already been recorded a year earlier by an R&B group called The Vibrations. It flopped, but these producers heard something buried beneath the surface. Raw voltage waiting for the right delivery system. When the McCoys walked into that audition wearing matching Beatles suits and perfect mop-top haircuts, they looked like a focus group's dream. Rick, still 17, already understood that image sold as hard as sound. But he also had instincts that separated him from every other teenage guitarist in America. He convinced the producers to tweak the title, change My Girl Sloopy to Hang On Sloopy. 3 extra letters, but psychologically, a completely different animal. One was passive, the other was a command. Urgent, desperate, alive. The session was fast and brutal. The New York pros controlled the instrumental backbone. The McCoys delivered the vocal punch that turned competent into combustible. The single dropped on Bang Records in August. By October, it had climbed to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Kicking the Beatles yesterday off the throne. Read that again. A 17-year-old from a railroad town in Ohio just beat the Beatles. The song became a phenomenon. Decades later, it would be named Ohio's official rock anthem, blasted at every Ohio State football game. Rick even heard rumors it was broadcast in Moscow's Red Square. American rock penetrating Soviet concrete. But here's where the fairy tale cracks. The McCoys were famous. The song was everywhere, and they were broke. The contracts they signed in their desperation to be heard, legal minefields designed to funnel money away from the talent and into the pockets of producers, managers, and label executives. The band saw pennies on the dollar. Rick would later admit, "We thought the music business was easy. All turns out we sold ourselves into indentured servitude." But the money wasn't even the worst part. Hang On Sloopy was so catchy, so bubblegum friendly, that it branded the McCoys as teen pop fluff. For musicians who studied blues, revered jazz, and wanted to be taken seriously as artists, this label was career poison. They tried to fight back, releasing heavier, more experimental albums like Infinite McCoys and Human Ball. But the audience had already decided who they were allowed to be. By the late 60s, the hits dried up. The McCoys became the house band at Steve Paul's Scene, a New York club, a long fall from chart-topping royalty to backing other people's dreams in dark rooms. Most stories would end here with bitterness and obscurity, but Rick Derringer's story was just beginning, because playing in that club every night put him in front of one man who would change everything. A blues guitarist with white hair and lightning in his fingers. 1969, New York City underground. Johnny Winter was a force of nature, an albino blues prodigy whose solos didn't just impress, they scorched. Fast, raw, unpredictable. The kind of player who could electrify a room or derail a recording session with equal ease. He needed a band that could handle the chaos without suffocating it. Enter Rick Derringer and the remnants of the McCoys. The new project was called Johnny Winter And. The And was code for Rick's crew, though management buried the McCoys' name to avoid the bubblegum stink that still clung to them. Here's what made this partnership lethal. Johnny brought fury, blistering improvisational genius, a blues authenticity, and star power. Rick brought structure, the ability to anchor Johnny's wildness, arrange it, produce it, and translate chaos into radio-ready art without castrating the danger. While Johnny soloed like a man possessed, Rick played rhythm guitar with a producer's brain, mapping out every section, every transition, thinking 3 moves ahead. The albums they created, Johnny Winter and Still Alive and Well, became blueprints for blues rock's golden age. But Rick's genius wasn't just supporting Johnny. He also started working with Johnny's younger brother, Edgar Winter. And that's where Rick transformed from player to mad scientist. Edgar's band had been jamming on this sprawling, formless instrumental. It was incredible in parts. Explosive keyboard runs, savage drum breaks, guitar stabs, but it was too long, too loose, too weird for commercial radio. Most producers would have said, "Tighten it up, play it again." Rick said, "Give me the tapes." He and Edgar locked themselves in the studio with razor blades and magnetic tape. They physically cut the recordings into fragments, isolating the best drum fill, the catchiest keyboard riff, the most explosive guitar moment, and then spliced them back together like surgeons rebuilding a body from the best parts of 10 different donors. The result? Frankenstein. It hit #1, earned a Grammy nomination, became one of the most iconic rock instrumentals ever recorded, and hardly anyone knew Rick Derringer's fingerprints were all over it. Around this same time, Rick wrote and recorded a song that would become his calling card, Rock and Roll, Hoochie Coo, pronounced Hoo-Chee Coo. Sue first recorded with Johnny Winter, then released on the live album Roadwork. It was everything 70s rock aspired to be: heavy, bluesy, rebellious, and built for maximum volume. By 1973, Rick Derringer wasn't just the sloopy kid anymore. He was one of the most respected architects in rock. But there was still one question gnawing at him and everyone around him. Could he step out of the shadows and become the star? Or was he destined to remain the genius no one remembered? October 1973, Rick Derringer made his move. He released his debut solo album, All American Boy. The timing looked flawless. He had momentum from the Winter Brothers' success, a reputation as a killer player and producer, a hit single locked and loaded, his own definitive version of rock and roll. Hoochie Coo, recorded at Colorado's legendary Caribou Ranch, the album was a showcase of range, hard rock thunder, country fried grit, sophisticated ballads co-written with an unknown poet named Patti Smith, guest spots from Joe Walsh and other A-listers. Rock and Roll, Hoochie Coo climbed to number 23 on the Billboard Hot 100. It became a permanent fixture on classic rock radio. Decades later, Stranger Things would resurrect it for a new generation. Critics raved. Underrated masterpiece. Virtuoso performance, but mainstream superstardom. It never arrived. Why? Because Rick Derringer had a problem the industry didn't know how to solve. He was too good at too many things. His guitar work was elite. His production was meticulous. His arrangements were sophisticated, but his voice, while solid, didn't have the raw, gravelly character that made Johnny Winter unforgettable, or the arena-shaking presence of the era's emerging rock gods. The market wanted icons, not craftsmen. It wanted singular, easily branded heroes you could put on a poster and define in 3 words. Rick was a Swiss Army knife in an age of specialized tools. Rock fans loved him, blues purists respected him, but no one could figure out which box to put him in. And in the music business, if you don't fit a box, you don't get the billboard. Rick later admitted he felt trapped. The industry kept demanding rock when his tastes were evolving toward jazz, toward grown-up arrangements, toward sonic territory that didn't involve power chords and leather. But the machine didn't care what he wanted. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss what happens when the culture turns against the craftsman. The late 70s saw Rick make one more push. He formed the band Derringer, a powerhouse quartet with Vinny Appice, pronounced R.P.Che, on drums, Kenny Aronson, pronounced A.R. on Son on bass, Danny Johnson on second guitar. They toured with Aerosmith Boston Tom Petty. They released hard rock albums. Derringer, Sweet Evil, If I Weren't So Romantic I'd Shoot You. Live, they were dynamite. On record, the magic didn't translate. But Rick's inability to capture lightning in a bottle wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that the world itself was mutating beneath his feet, and no amount of talent could stop what was coming. Late 1970s. Imagine spending 15 years perfecting your craft. Thousands of hours mastering technique, tone, theory, only to wake up one morning and discover the rules have been rewritten overnight. That's what happened to Rick Derringer. In 1977, punk rock exploded out of New York and London like a Molotov cocktail through a storefront window. 3 chords, raw attitude, and a middle finger to everything Rick represented. Technical skill, boring, studio polish, corporate, guitar solos, dinosaur nonsense. The Ramones, the Sex Pistols, the Clash. They weren't better musicians than Rick. They just didn't care about being better. They cared about being real, raw, and fast. Then disco seized the charts. Synthesizers replaced live bands. Drum machines replaced drummers. The craft Rick had spent his life mastering was being automated, digitized, rendered optional. And then came MTV in 1981. Suddenly, the album wasn't enough. The song wasn't enough. You needed a face, a look, a visual narrative that played in 3-minute bursts between Duran Duran and Michael Jackson. Rick Derringer had spent decades building sonic worlds. Now the battlefield had moved to television screens, fashion shoots, and choreographed spectacle. His band couldn't capture their live fire on tape. His attempts to adapt, flirting with disco influences on tracks like Envy, were dismissed as desperate or embarrassing. By 1978, the band Derringer fractured. The dream of Rick as a stadium headliner evaporated. Most documentaries would label this failure, but that's not what this was. Rick Derringer didn't fail. The game changed. He was a master craftsman born into an industrial revolution, a man who built cathedrals of sound in an era that suddenly preferred fast food. He wasn't obsolete, he was inconvenient. So what do you do when the spotlight moves on, but your hands still know how to build magic? You go where the work still respects the craft. The 1980s. While MTV crowned new kings and synthesizers dominated the airwaves, a quieter class of musicians was shaping the decade from behind soundproof glass. Rick Derringer became one of those ghosts. He returned to what he'd always done best: session work and production, and the diversity of artists who wanted his fingerprints on their records was staggering. Steely Dan, the most demanding perfectionist band in rock, called him in. If you weren't flawless, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen, pronounced F-A-G-N, fired you mid-session. Rick made the cut. He played for Alice Cooper, adding menace to metal, for Cyndi Lauper, threading rock DNA into pop anthems, for Barbra Streisand, proving that even pristine pop needed muscle. His soaring guitar work elevated power ballads like Making Love Out of Nothing at All and the epic drama behind Bonnie Tyler's voice. If the 60s made him a prodigy and the 70s made him an architect, the 80s turned him into a phantom, everywhere and nowhere, essential and invisible. Then came a curveball no one saw coming. In the mid-80s, Rick discovered a nerdy accordion player making comedy songs. The guy's name was Weird Al Yankovic, pronounced Yankovic. Most people laughed him off. Rick heard precision, musicianship, and comedic genius wrapped in parody. He produced Weird Al's first 6 albums, including the Grammy-winning mega hits Eat It and Fat, parodies that became as iconic as the Michael Jackson originals they mocked. The collaboration was artistically fulfilling, financially lucrative, and it destroyed Rick's credibility with serious rock acts. Suddenly, in the eyes of major alternative and rock bands, Rick Derringer wasn't the blues rock architect anymore. He was the novelty guy, the producer of jokes. Would a band chasing critical acclaim want their album produced by the man behind Eat It, even if he was technically brilliant? Many didn't. Once again, his success in one lane closed doors in another. Then, in 1985, something even stranger happened. Rick got a call from the World Wrestling Federation. They wanted an album, big, loud, theatrical. And for one track, Rick and his partner set themselves an audacious goal: write the most patriotic rock song ever created. Not subtle, not cool, just pure, uncut American mythology set to power chords. They called it Real American, originally written for a tag team called the US Express. The song was reassigned to a blonde, mustachioed giant named Hulk Hogan, and it became legendary. Every time Hogan walked to the ring, that opening riff hit like a thunderclap. Millions of kids felt their spines tingle. The song didn't just introduce a wrestler, it summoned an archetype. But the song refused to stay in wrestling rings. It leaked into political rallies. Barack Obama used it. Hillary Clinton used it. Donald Trump used it. It became a sonic shorthand for America itself, crossing party lines, generations, ideologies. Rick Derringer had written one of the most recognizable anthems in modern culture, and most people who sang along had no idea who wrote it. If you've ever felt like you did the work while someone else took the bow, you already understand Rick Derringer. Late 1980s, the whirlwind had exacted a toll: divorce, professional frustration, the weight of being almost famous in a dozen different lanes while never quite owning one. Some artists drown in that, others burn out spectacularly. Rick Derringer did something unexpected. He turned inward. Returning to his Christian faith, he began reframing his career and his music through a spiritual lens. Classic hits like Still Alive and Well were reinterpreted to reflect resurrection, redemption, renewal. He didn't stop performing. He joined Ringo Starr's all-star band from 2011 to 2014, sharing stages with other veterans. He toured, collaborated, recorded, and aged not as a bitter relic, but as a working musician who never stopped loving the instrument. And yet, one symbol of recognition never came. No induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, not as a solo artist, not as a member of the McCoys, not as a sideman, producer, or musical excellence honoree. He had a #1 hit at 17, production credits on era-defining records, a signature rock anthem in Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo, a Grammy-nominated instrumental masterpiece in Frankenstein, one of the most recognizable American anthems ever written in real American. And the hall's doors stayed locked. Fans and fellow musicians created a tongue-in-cheek honor, the Foyer of Fame, a recognition that Rick mattered deeply but never fit the institution's narrow categories. It was funny and heartbreaking because it raised a question that haunts every artist who builds culture from the shadows. Who decides which architects we remember and which ones we erase? 2025. After 60 years of constant motion, Rick Derringer's body demanded a pause. In March, he underwent triple bypass heart surgery. Friends and family said he was recovering well, even joking about getting back on the road. Then, on May 26, 2025, everything stopped. Getting ready for bed at his Florida home, Rick suddenly went into distress. Rushed to the hospital, machines, wires, vigil, surrounded by his wife Jenda, pronounced Jenda, and closest friends. Rick Derringer was taken off life support. He was 77 years old. No overdose, no scandal, no tabloid ending, just a craftsman whose heart, after propelling sound through amplifiers for 6 decades, finally went silent. The headlines were predictable. Rock guitarist dead at 77. Mentions of Hang On Sloopy, Hoochie Coo, maybe Hulk Hogan's theme. But the musicians who really knew, they spoke about something deeper. About a man who could walk into a studio and turn good into great. About how he supported geniuses like Johnny Winter without smothering them. About the humility it took to be the backbone of other people's glory. Rick Derringer's story doesn't fit the rock myth template. He didn't crash. He didn't burn out. He just kept working while the spotlight spun elsewhere. He was never the perfect rock myth. He was something rarer. A worker, an artisan, a man who showed that you can change culture profoundly without ever being the face on the poster. And that leaves one final question for you. If a teenager from a railroad town can beat the Beatles, engineer monsters from tape, soundtrack wrestlers and presidents, and still end up undervalued, what does that say about how we measure success and who we choose to remember? If you made it this far, you're not a casual listener. You're someone who values the architects behind the curtain. So here's your mission. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're diving deep into more untold stories of music's forgotten heroes. Drop a comment. What was your first Rick Derringer moment? Hang On Sloopy? Hoochie Coo? Hulk Hogan's entrance? Something totally unexpected? And share this video with one person who thinks they know rock history, because Rick Derringer's story deserves to be heard. As long as people keep discovering his work, Rick Derringer isn't just a name in the credits. He's still alive and well in every riff that refuses to die. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join us for more stories from the shadows of rock and roll.